November 1993. The Indiana sky hung low and colorless, pressed down by clouds that hadn't broken in 3 days. In the town of Greenfield, 40 miles east of Indianapolis, the Morrison hardware store still had its Halloween decorations up. Orange and black crepe paper sagging in the windows, a cardboard skeleton whose joints had gone loose. Nobody had bothered taking them down. The owner's son had been missing for 2 weeks. Tyler Brennan was 23 years old when he vanished. He worked the register at his father's store, lived above it in a cramped apartment that smelled like sawdust and old paint, and kept to himself in a way that made people uncomfortable. Not antisocial exactly, just quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you wonder what someone's thinking about all the time. His father, Robert Brennan, was the one who reported him missing. Tyler hadn't shown up to open the store on a Tuesday morning. His apartment door was unlocked. His bed was made. His keys were on the kitchen counter next to an empty coffee mug. Everything looked normal, except Tyler was gone. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Now let's get back to Tyler's disappearance. The Greenfield Police Department treated it like a runaway at first. 23-year-old man, no wife, no kids, works for his dad in a dying hardware store. Maybe he just needed out. But Robert knew better. Tyler wasn't the running type. He was the staying type, the type who showed up even when he didn't want to, who fulfilled obligations even when they crushed him. The investigation went nowhere fast. Tyler's truck was still parked behind the store. His bank account hadn't been touched. He'd left behind his wallet, his jacket, even his glasses, thick frames. He needed to see anything past 10 feet. Detective Linda Park, who caught the case, interviewed everyone who knew him. The consensus was always the same. Tyler was a nice kid, kept his head down, didn't cause trouble, but nice kids disappeared too. Robert Brennan spent the winter of 1993 putting up flyers. Tyler's face, thin, serious, with dark eyes that looked older than 23, appeared on telephone poles throughout Marion County. The hardware store stayed open, but barely. Robert would stand behind the counter where his son used to stand, staring at the door, waiting for Tyler to walk through it with some explanation that would make everything make sense. He never did. The flyers stayed up through Christmas. Robert couldn't bring himself to take them down, even when the tape yellowed and the paper curled at the edges. The hardware store became a shrine of sorts, filled with the absence of the person who should have been there. Customers would come in, buy their nails and their paint, and avoid Robert's eyes. What do you say to a father whose son vanished into thin air? Detective Park worked the case harder than most. She was 39 years old, divorced, childless, and she poured everything into her investigations because they were all she had. She interviewed Tyler's high school friends, the few he'd kept in touch with. She talked to his teachers from Greenfield High, to the librarians at the public library where he'd spent hours reading, to the cashier at the grocery store who said Tyler always bought the same things: white bread, peanut butter, coffee, and bananas. She built a picture of Tyler Brennan that was achingly ordinary. He'd graduated high school in 1988 with decent grades. He'd thought about college but couldn't afford it. His mother had died when he was 16, cancer, and after that, it was just him and his father. The hardware store was the family business, started by Robert's father in 1952, and Tyler had slipped into working there the way water slips into cracks. Park found Tyler's high school girlfriend, Ashley Henderson, who'd married someone else and moved to Fishers. Ashley cried when Park asked about Tyler. They'd dated for 2 years, she said, but Tyler had broken it off senior year. He'd told her he didn't want to trap her in Greenfield, that she deserved better than a life stuck in a hardware store. He was always thinking about other people, Ashley said, wiping her eyes. Never about himself. I used to get so mad at him for that. I told him he mattered too, but I don't think he ever believed me. Park asked if Tyler had seemed depressed. if he'd ever talked about leaving. Ashley shook her head. Tyler wasn't the running away type. He was the endure it quietly type. Whatever happened to him, it wasn't because he wanted out. Someone took him. I know it. But there was no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle in the apartment, no witnesses who'd seen anything unusual. Tyler had simply ceased to exist between the hours of midnight on November 15th and 6 in the morning on November 16th, when Robert had knocked on his son's apartment door and found it unlocked and empty. Park worked the case for 6 months before her captain told her to move on. There were other cases, other victims, other families who needed answers. Tyler Brennan's file went into a cabinet, and the investigation went cold. By spring of 1994, the flyers had faded and torn. By summer, people stopped asking Robert about Tyler. By the time the leaves turned in October, a year after Tyler's disappearance, Greenfield had moved on. Small towns are good at that. They fold tragedies into their history and keep going, because what else can they do? Robert kept the hardware store open for another 9 years. He worked alone, opening at 7 and closing at 6, standing behind the same counter where Tyler used to stand. Customers said he aged 10 years for every one that passed. The diabetes got worse. His hands shook when he made change. In 2003, he finally sold the building to a developer from Indianapolis and moved into a small house on the edge of town. He died in 2019. Heart failure, the death certificate said, but everyone who knew him understood it was heartbreak compounded over 26 years. At his funeral, people talked about what a good man he'd been, how he'd kept the store going even after his son disappeared, how he'd never given up hope. But the truth was darker than that. Robert had given up hope. He'd given up the day he realized Tyler wasn't coming back. The hardware store sat empty for years after Robert sold it. The developer's plans fell through. The building became one of those forgotten spaces that every town has. Windows covered in newspaper, door chained shut, paint peeling like dead skin. Teenagers told stories about it being haunted. Some people said they'd seen lights in the second-floor windows late at night, heard footsteps on the stairs. But those were just stories. Grief creates ghosts even when there aren't any. In 2015, the building was sold again, this time to a yoga instructor who wanted to convert it into a studio. The renovations started but never finished. Money problems, people said. The building sat empty again. More years passed, more paint peeled, more windows broke. Greenfield grew around it, new subdivisions spreading like moss. But the old hardware store remained, a gap in the town's smile. Then in January 2025, Veronica and James Caldwell bought the building. They were in their 30s, transplants from Indianapolis who'd fallen in love with Greenfield's small-town charm and affordable real estate. James worked remotely for a tech company. Veronica had always wanted to open a coffee shop. The old hardware store seemed perfect. High ceilings, original brick walls, a kind of shabby authenticity that you couldn't fake. They hired Carlos Mendez to handle the renovations. Carlos had been doing construction in Greenfield for 8 years. He knew the building's history, everyone did, but he didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in studs and joists and whether the wiring was up to code. The renovation started on a cold January morning. Carlos and his crew gutted the first floor, tearing out the drop ceiling and the cheap paneling that someone had installed in the 80s. Upstairs, in what used to be Tyler's apartment, they found layers of history, wallpaper from the 50s, under wallpaper from the 70s, under paint from the 90s. Carlos peeled it all away, down to the original plaster. That's when he found the false wall. It was in the northeast corner of what had been Tyler's bedroom. Someone had built a wall about 18 inches in front of the original wall, creating a narrow dead space. The work was sloppy, crooked studs, uneven drywall, the kind of construction that made Carlos wince. He assumed it had been built to hide old pipes or wiring, something that needed access but wasn't pretty to look at. He started pulling down the drywall. No pipes, no wiring, just empty space and dust. He was about to move on when he saw something wedged between two studs about 5 feet off the ground. A notebook. Carlos pulled it out carefully. It was a composition notebook, the kind kids use in school, with a black and white marbled cover. The cover was bent and water-stained, the edges soft with age. He almost threw it away. Old buildings are full of junk, but something made him open it. The first page had a name written in blue ballpoint pen, Tyler Brennan. Carlos stood there for a long moment, holding the notebook, feeling the weight of it. He'd heard the stories about Tyler Brennan. The son who disappeared. The father who died of a broken heart. Everyone in Greenfield knew those stories. He called Veronica Caldwell. She arrived within 20 minutes, her face pale when she saw the notebook. They sat on the dusty floor and opened it together, and what they found inside changed everything. The journal was dated. The first entry was from August 1993, 3 months before Tyler disappeared. The handwriting was small and cramped, slanting to the right. The words pressed hard into the paper like Tyler had been trying to make them permanent. The early entries were ordinary. Tyler wrote about working at the store, about customers who complained about prices, about his father's declining health. Robert's diabetes was getting worse, Tyler wrote. He wasn't taking care of himself. Tyler worried about what would happen when his father couldn't work anymore, when the responsibility of the store fell completely on Tyler's shoulders. "Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning," Tyler wrote in an entry from August 17th. "Like the store is water, and it's filling my lungs and I can't breathe. But I can't leave. Dad needs me. And what would I even do if I left? I don't know how to be anything except this." The entries continued through August and September. Tyler wrote about loneliness, about watching his high school friends move away and start lives while he stayed stuck. He wrote about the monotony of small-town life, the way every day felt the same. He wrote about lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all there was. Then, in an entry dated September 12th, everything changed. "I met someone today," Tyler wrote. "His name is Vincent. I was having lunch at this diner in Indianapolis. I'd driven up to pick up supplies, and he sat down at the counter next to me, just started talking, asked where I was from, what I did. Usually I hate that kind of thing, but Vincent was different. He really listened, like he actually cared about what I was saying. We talked for 2 hours. He's a sales rep, travels a lot. He told me about all the places he's been. Made my life sound so small by comparison, but not in a mean way, just factual. We exchanged numbers. He said, maybe we could grab coffee sometime." Carlos and Veronica read that entry twice. Then they kept reading. Tyler and Vincent met again on September 19th, then again on September 26th. The entries about Vincent grew longer, more detailed. Tyler wrote about how Vincent made him feel understood, how Vincent didn't judge him for working in a hardware store or for living in Greenfield. Vincent talked about his own struggles, Tyler wrote. About growing up poor, about working his way up, about how he'd learned that sometimes you have to create your own opportunities. "Vincent says I'm smart," Tyler wrote on October 3rd. "Nobody's said that to me in years. Dad just sees me as someone to run the cash register. But Vincent thinks I could do more. He asked if I'd ever thought about moving away, starting over somewhere new. I told him I couldn't leave Dad. Vincent said sometimes you have to choose yourself. That staying out of obligation isn't the same as staying out of love." The entries continued through October. Vincent and Tyler met every few days, usually in Indianapolis. Coffee shops, a bookstore on Massachusetts Avenue, a park near the canal. Tyler wrote about feeling alive for the first time since his mother died. He wrote about Vincent's laugh, the way Vincent remembered details from their conversations, the way Vincent made Tyler feel like he mattered. But then, in late October, the tone of the entries began to shift. "Vincent asked me for a favor today," Tyler wrote on October 24th. "He's been having some packages delivered to his apartment, but he's traveling so much he's worried about them getting stolen. He asked if he could have a few things sent to the store instead, said he'd pick them up after closing. I said yes. I don't know why I feel weird about it. It's just packages." The packages started arriving the next week. Tyler wrote about signing for them. Plain cardboard boxes, no return address, addressed to Vincent Caruso. Vincent would show up after the store closed, usually around 8 or 9 at night, and load them into his car. He never opened them in front of Tyler. He never said what was inside. "I know I should ask," Tyler wrote on November 2nd, "but I don't want Vincent to think I don't trust him. He's been so good to me, given me someone to talk to, made me feel less alone. If he needs help with some deliveries, that's the least I can do." On November 6th, Tyler wrote about a conversation that had bothered him. Vincent had asked if Tyler had a passport. Tyler said no. Vincent said Tyler should get one. "You never know when you might need it," Vincent had said. "Opportunities come up fast sometimes." Tyler wrote, "I asked what he meant. Vincent just smiled and said he had connections, people who could help someone start fresh if they wanted. New city, new name, new life." I laughed it off, but Vincent was serious. He said some people aren't meant for small towns, that some people are bigger than the boxes life puts them in. I didn't know what to say. Carlos and Veronica kept reading, their hands shaking now. The entries from November were different, darker. Tyler's handwriting got messier, the words more urgent. On November 10th, Tyler wrote, "Vincent asked me something strange today. He wanted to know if I'd ever thought about disappearing. Really disappearing. Starting over somewhere no one knew me. I told him that was crazy. He said it wasn't. That people do it all the time, that there are ways to become someone new if you're willing to take the risk. I asked why he was talking about this. He said he just wanted me to know that I had options, that I wasn't as trapped as I thought." On November 12th, "Vincent wants me to meet someone, a friend of his who helps people with transitions." That's the word he used, transitions. I asked what that meant. Vincent said it meant helping people who want to leave their old lives behind. New documents, new identity, new start. He said this friend owed him a favor and could help me if I wanted. I told him I didn't know. Vincent said I should at least meet the guy. Said it couldn't hurt to explore my options. We're meeting Sunday night in Indianapolis. And then the final entry. November 14th, 1993. Just a few lines, written in handwriting that looked rushed, almost frantic. "Meeting Vincent tonight at 9. He says his friend will be there. Says after this meeting everything changes. I can decide if I want to stay in Greenfield or start over somewhere new. I'm terrified, but I'm also excited. Maybe this is my chance. Maybe this is how I finally get out. If anyone finds this and I'm gone, I chose this. I wanted this. Tell Dad I'm sorry." That was the last entry. The rest of the pages were blank. Carlos and Veronica sat in silence for a long time after reading those words. Then Veronica called the police. Detective Linda Park was 71 years old and officially retired. She lived in a ranch house near Franklin, spent her days gardening and visiting her grandchildren, and tried very hard not to think about the cases she'd never solved. But when she got the call from the Greenfield Police Department about Tyler Brennan's journal, she was in her car within 20 minutes. She arrived at the old hardware store and read the journal 3 times. Each time, she felt something cold settle deeper in her chest. She'd worked this case for 6 months in 1993 and 1994. She'd interviewed everyone who knew Tyler. She'd searched for any sign of where he might have gone. And all along, the answer had been hidden in a wall 18 inches from where Tyler used to sleep. Park looked at the false wall, at the sloppy construction, at the space where the journal had been hidden. She asked Carlos how the wall had been built. Carlos said it looked like amateur work, like someone had thrown it up fast without caring about quality. Park nodded. She'd seen this before. Quick construction to hide something, to seal something away. She called the current Greenfield police chief and requested a full forensic team. Then she called the FBI, because Park knew what the journal meant. She'd been a detective long enough to recognize the pattern. An older man befriending a lonely young man. Promises of escape, of a new life, requests for small favors that gradually escalated. And then the young man disappeared. This wasn't a runaway case. It never had been. This was something much darker. The forensic team arrived the next morning. They brought ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, thermal imaging equipment. Park watched them work, her jaw tight, her hands clenched. She was 71 years old, and her knees hurt, and she'd promised herself she was done with this. But here she was, back in the place where Tyler Brennan had last been seen, searching for answers that were 32 years old. The dogs hit on something in the crawl space beneath the second floor. The radar confirmed it. There was something down there, hidden behind the original brick foundation, sealed away in the darkness. It took 3 days to excavate. Carlos and his crew carefully removed floorboards, cut through joists, created access to the crawl space. Park supervised every step. The Caldwells watched from the first floor, pale and silent. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. On the 3rd day, they found him. Tyler Brennan's remains were wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting and canvas, tucked into a space between the foundation wall and the floor joists. The body had mummified in the dry space, preserved by the decades. Even after all this time, even after 32 years, Park recognized him from the photos she'd studied so many times. The thin face, the dark hair, the thick-framed glasses still on his skull. The medical examiner determined cause of death, blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Tyler had been struck from behind, probably with something heavy. He died quickly, the examiner said. He probably hadn't suffered. Park stood in the cold January air outside the building and cried for the first time in 10 years. Cried for Tyler, who'd wanted so desperately to escape. Cried for Robert, who died not knowing his son had never left. Cried for herself, for the 32 years she'd wondered if she'd missed something, if she could have saved him. But now there was work to do. Tyler had been found. Now Park had to find Vincent. She went back to the journal and started with the name, Vincent Caruso. She ran it through every database she had access to, called in favors with the FBI, contacted police departments across Indiana and neighboring states. It took 2 weeks, but she found him. Vincent Caruso was 74 years old in 2025, born in Gary, Indiana, in 1951. He'd worked for a freight company through the 80s, traveling across the Midwest, until he was fired in 1989 for falsifying delivery records. After that, his employment history got spotty. A few months here, a few months there, always sales or logistics, always traveling. He'd lived in Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, never stayed anywhere long, never put down roots. The FBI found complaints in his file from co-workers over the years. Nothing criminal, just uncomfortable behavior. Getting too friendly with younger employees, asking personal questions, offering help that felt inappropriate. The kind of thing that gets you labeled as creepy, but doesn't get you arrested. Park dug deeper. She started looking at missing persons cases from the early 90s, young men between 20 and 30, last seen with someone they'd described as a friend or mentor. She found 6 cases that matched the pattern. 6 young men who disappeared between 1991 and 1994 from small towns across Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. All of them had been working dead-end jobs. All of them had been lonely. All of them had been last seen meeting someone older who'd promised to help them. Two of the cases had journals or letters left behind. One mentioned someone named Vincent, another mentioned someone named Victor. Park's stomach turned. Vincent Caruso had been doing this for years. Tyler Brennan wasn't his first victim. He probably wasn't his last. The FBI located Caruso living in a trailer park outside Dayton, Ohio. When agents knocked on his door on a cold February morning, they found a man who looked 20 years older than his age. Emphysema had eaten away his lungs. He could barely walk without oxygen. He answered the door in a bathrobe, his face gray, his eyes flat. They searched his trailer. They found boxes of personal items belonging to young men, journals, photographs, ID cards, social security cards. Park recognized some of the names from her research. Some she didn't recognize at all, young men whose disappearances had never even been reported, whose families had perhaps assumed they'd just moved on. Caruso didn't confess, not exactly. He sat in the interrogation room with his oxygen tank hissing beside him and said the same thing over and over. They wanted to leave. I helped them leave. The FBI didn't believe him, neither did Park. The evidence painted a different picture. Caruso had targeted vulnerable young men, befriended them, gained their trust, and then lured them to isolated locations with promises of new identities and fresh starts. And then he'd killed them. But Caruso wasn't talking. His lawyer advised him to stay silent. Without Caruso's confession, without more bodies, building a case was difficult. They had Tyler's body and the journal, which was strong evidence for that murder. But the others, the 6 other missing men, those were harder to prove. Park worked with the FBI to search properties connected to Caruso, storage units, apartments he'd rented, the homes of relatives. They found 2 more bodies, one in rural Ohio, buried on property Caruso's uncle had owned in the early 90s, and one in Michigan, hidden in the basement of an abandoned warehouse. Both had died the same way Tyler had, blunt force trauma from behind. Both had been young men reported missing in 1992 and 1993. Both had left behind notes or told friends they were meeting someone who was going to help them start over. Caruso was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecutor wanted to charge him with more, but without bodies or conclusive evidence linking him to the other disappearances, they stuck with what they could prove. 3 murders. 3 families who finally had answers after decades of not knowing. The trial was scheduled for September 2025, but Caruso never made it to trial. His emphysema worsened over the summer. In August, he was hospitalized. He died on August 29th, his lungs finally giving out, taking whatever other secrets he had to his grave. Park was in the hospital waiting room when she heard. She'd been there every day, hoping Caruso would finally talk, finally give up the locations of the other victims. But he never did. He died in silence, the way his victims had died. But Tyler's story didn't end with Caruso's death. Park made sure of that. She worked with the FBI to identify the other potential victims, to contact their families, to bring them whatever closure could be found after so much time. She wrote reports. She gave interviews. She made sure the world knew what Vincent Caruso had done, how he'd preyed on lonely young men, how he'd used their desperation against them. Robert Brennan was already gone, but Park found Tyler's distant relatives, a cousin in Ohio, an aunt in California, people who'd barely known Tyler but who wept when they heard what had happened to him. They held a funeral in Greenfield in the spring of 2025. It rained that day, a soft, steady rain that made the cemetery grass smell green and alive. Park stood at the graveside and watched them lower Tyler's coffin into the ground, 32 years after he should have been buried. She thought about all the years she'd spent wondering, all the nights she'd lain awake trying to piece together what had happened. She thought about how close the answer had been all along, hidden in a wall, sealed away in darkness, waiting for someone to find it. After the funeral, Park went back to the building one last time. The Caldwells had decided to continue with their renovations. The coffee shop opened in June, and they named it Tyler's, in honor of the young man whose story had been hidden inside those walls for so long. On the wall behind the counter, they hung a framed photograph of Tyler from 1993. Thin face, dark eyes, the ghost of a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Underneath the photo, they placed a small plaque. For those who feel trapped, there is always another way. You are not alone. Park visited the coffee shop sometimes. She'd sit in the corner with a cup of coffee and watch people come and go, and she'd think about Tyler, about the life he'd wanted and never got to live. She'd think about Vincent Caruso and the darkness that hides behind friendly smiles and promises of escape. Mostly, though, she'd think about the journal, about Tyler's final words. "Tell Dad I'm sorry." Tyler had nothing to be sorry for. He'd been a good son who'd stayed when he wanted to leave, who'd worked when he wanted to dream, who'd sacrificed his own happiness for his father's needs. And when he'd finally reached for something different, when he'd finally tried to choose himself, a monster had been waiting. The journal itself was kept as evidence during the trial preparations, then eventually transferred to the Indiana State Archives after Caruso's death. Researchers requested access to it. Journalists wanted to study it. True crime podcasters wanted to read from it. But Park fought to keep it sealed. Tyler's words weren't entertainment. They were his private thoughts, his fears and hopes, written in the weeks before his life ended. In the end, she won. The journal remains sealed, accessible only to law enforcement and Tyler's family. His story is public, but his words are his own. 32 years. That's how long it took for Tyler Brennan to come home. That's how long it took for the truth to break through the walls that had hidden it. And in Greenfield, Indiana, in a coffee shop that used to be a hardware store, people still talk about the journal in the wall, about the young man who wanted to escape, and about the detective who never gave up on finding him. Park is 72 now. She doesn't work cases anymore. Her knees hurt too much for long days on her feet, and her eyes aren't what they used to be. But sometimes, late at night when she can't sleep, she thinks about all the other Tyler Brennans out there, the lonely ones, the trapped ones, the ones looking for a way out. And she hopes they find it the right way, the safe way, not hidden in a wall, not buried in silence, but out in the light, where someone can see them, where someone can help. Because everyone deserves to be found. Even 32 years later, even when the world has moved on, even when it seems like no one is looking anymore, Tyler Brennan was found, his story was told. And maybe, in that telling, there's hope for all the others still waiting to be discovered, still waiting to come home.